The line had been quiet for days, too quiet to invite confidence, but calm enough to dull urgency. Patrol reports came in clean, no contact, no movement, engines unheard beyond the tree line, maps showed nothing unusual, and the ground, on paper, was firm enough to carry armor without concern. Command treated the sector as routine, a holding front. Weather noted, then dismissed. The rain had passed overnight, light and steady, the kind that rarely altered planning. Tracks were expected to cut through without trouble. Weight tables remained unchanged. Movement schedules stayed intact. Men settled into the rhythm that forms when danger does not announce itself. Watches were rotated. Weapons cleaned. Boots scraped dry against boards. The landscape offered no warning. Fields lay flat and dark. Low ground pooled with shallow water, thin enough to ignore, wide enough to overlook. The air held that heavy stillness that followed rain, pressing down without sound. German armor doctrine relied on momentum, speed, shock. The assumption was simply steel moved where infantry could not. Ground yielded under tracks, not the other way around. That belief shaped decisions far behind the line, where maps stayed clean and soil remained theoretical. Across the front, Allied observers watched without interference. They did not see an attack forming. They saw something subtler, a delay, a pause that did not fit standard movement patterns. The earth looked unchanged, but boots sank slightly deeper than expected. Vehicle ruts did not drain. The surface skin held, while the body underneath softened. No alarms were raised. There was no reason yet. This was not an engagement. Just terrain behaving a little differently than expected. Orders remained cautious but unchanged. If armor moved, it would be tracked. If it advanced, it would be answered. No one spoke of interference before contact. No one planned to fight the ground itself. That was not how battles were taught. The assumption held because it always had. Armor overcame distance. Terrain slowed but did not stop. Weather was background, not a weapon. A minor variable, logged and filed away. But small variables are patient. They do not announce themselves with noise or fire. They wait beneath weight, beneath confidence, beneath routine. As daylight crept higher, the soil continued to absorb what had fallen in the night. Water settled where it could not escape. The surface stayed calm, almost solid, enough to deceive the eye, enough to support the belief that nothing here would matter. Along the front, men stood ready for a fight that had not yet begun, unaware that the decisive factor was already in place. Not an ambush, not a gun line, just ground that no longer behaved as expected. The danger did not move toward them. It waited, quiet, unnoticed, already positioned to decide what steel could not. German armored doctrine was built on certainty. Movement was power. Speed created shock, and shock fractured resistance before it could organize. Tanks were not meant to hesitate. They advanced, adjusted, and advanced again. Manuals emphasized momentum over caution, control over pause. Terrain was a variable, but rarely a limiter. Tracks were designed to dominate it. Training reinforced that belief. Crews learned to trust the machine beneath them. Weight distribution, engine torque, and track width were calculated to overcome soft ground, shallow water, and broken fields. Mud slowed progress, but doctrine assumed it could not deny it. If infantry could walk it, armor could cross it. If infantry could not, armor would still try. From the Allied side, this pattern was well understood. Panzer units moved decisively once committed. Delays usually signaled command confusion, fuel shortages, or enemy contact. A stationary armored element without fire support was unusual. Armor existed to press forward, not wait. Observers along the line watched for those familiar indicators: engine noise, formation changes, escort infantry shifting positions. None appeared. Instead, movement reports showed something inconsistent. Vehicles advanced in short increments, then stopped. Not tactically. Mechanically. Maps did not explain it. According to charts, the ground should have held. Drainage lines were marked. Soil type was listed as workable. The rain registered as insignificant. Nothing on paper suggested a constraint severe enough to slow armor, let alone halt it. Yet field notes began to diverge from expectation. Tracks were not rolling cleanly. Turns required correction. Vehicles adjusted spacing more than doctrine required. These were not combat behaviors. They were compensations. The contradiction was subtle, easy to dismiss. Manuals did not account for ground that looked firm but failed under sustained weight. They did not describe soil that absorbed water unevenly, forming a surface strong enough to deceive and weak enough to collapse once stressed. Doctrine assumed consistency. Dirt did not provide it. Allied officers compared reports carefully. They did not celebrate the discrepancy. They questioned it. Armor doctrine was reliable because it had been tested repeatedly. When it failed, something specific was interfering. Not enemy action. Not command error. Something unplanned. This was not yet a flaw in doctrine. It was a question mark, a minor irregularity against a body of established practice. But war does not change through dramatic breaks. It shifts through small contradictions that resist explanation. Confidence remained intact, but it softened. Not enough to alter orders. Enough to sharpen attention. The manuals still held authority. The tanks still carried power. But the ground was no longer behaving as doctrine expected, and no rulebook offered guidance for fighting soil that refused to cooperate. For now, the discrepancy remained academic, an observation without consequence, a detail noted and filed. But once doctrine and reality begin to separate, even slightly, the gap has a way of widening on its own. The weather briefing had been short. Rain overnight. Light to moderate. No follow-up required. It was logged as background, not influence. The kind of note that rarely altered movement plans or command intent. But the rain had not fallen evenly. It settled into low ground and pooled where drainage failed. Water soaked downward instead of running off. The surface held its shape while the layers beneath softened. The change was gradual, quiet, and unremarkable to the eye. Soil conditions were noted in routine reports: moist, dark, compressible under load. Nothing unusual on its own. No alarms attached. No red ink. Just another entry among dozens, passed upward without emphasis. The ground absorbed weight differently than expected. Foot patrols noticed it first. Boots pressed deeper with each step. Not enough to slow movement, but enough to register. Tracks left sharper impressions. Ruts filled slowly instead of draining. None of it suggested danger. It suggested inconvenience. Armor calculations still assumed continuity. If the first vehicle passed, the next would follow. Load-bearing estimates relied on averages, not accumulation. What the charts did not show was saturation. The way soil loses integrity once stressed repeatedly in the same place. The rain had done its work quietly. It did not flood. It did not freeze. It did not announce itself as a threat. It waited under pressure. Under steel. Under routine. Allied observers continued to log conditions without interpretation. Weather was not an enemy. It was not something to fight. It was a constant, like distance or time. It shaped the field, but rarely decided outcomes on its own. Movement assumptions began to thin at the edges. Vehicles advanced with caution not specified in doctrine. Stops lengthened. Adjustments multiplied. These were not tactical pauses. They were responses to resistance that did not fire back. Command remained focused on enemy intent. Where armor would move, when contact would occur, weather did not enter the discussion beyond confirmation that it posed no immediate threat. Plans stayed intact because nothing had violated them directly. The environment, meanwhile, continued to change without acknowledgement. Water settled deeper. Soil compressed further. The margin between movement and immobility narrowed with each passing minute. No orders reflected the shift. No warnings followed the reports. This was not negligence. It was habit. Weather had always been background. Something to work through, not something that worked against you. Risk does not always announce itself as danger. Sometimes it arrives as familiarity, as conditions assumed safe, because they usually are. By the time tension surfaced, it was not because the rain had fallen. It was because it had been ignored. The ground had become an active participant without ever being invited into the plan. The battlefield had not changed visibly. It had changed structurally, and that change was already shaping what armor could do long before anyone was prepared to admit it. The Panzer Platoon was built for movement. Its crews were trained, its machines maintained, its role clearly defined. Medium tanks formed the core, supported by vehicles assigned to maintain spacing and control. Each element knew its function: advance, maintain cohesion, respond to resistance. This was a formation designed to apply pressure, not absorb it. Orders placed the platoon forward, but not yet committed. It was a positioning move, not an assault. Armor was expected to probe, establish presence, and prepare the ground for what would follow. Nothing in the briefing suggested resistance, beyond routine observation. The route selected had been used before. The terrain was familiar. The mission appeared standard. Initial movement began on schedule. Engines turned over cleanly, tracks engaged. The formation advanced without contact. Then the pace changed. Progress slowed in small increments, not abruptly, just enough to require adjustment. Spacing widened. Vehicles corrected alignment more often than expected. The delays were minor, measured in seconds, not minutes, easily explained as caution, soil conditions, visibility, crew coordination. None of it rose to the level of concern. Reports reflected this tone: movement reduced but ongoing. No mechanical failures noted. As the platoon continued, the resistance became consistent. Tracks slipped without obvious cause. Turns required added power. Forward momentum came in short bursts instead of steady motion. Each correction compounded the next. The formation held, but only with effort. Command noticed the change. Not as a threat, but as an irregularity. Questions were asked quietly. Was the ground softer than expected? Were loads heavier? Was spacing affecting traction? No single answer presented itself. Doctrine offered solutions for enemy interference, not environmental hesitation. There was no panic. Crews did not abandon formation. Engines were not over-revved. Procedures were followed. When movement slowed, it was managed. When adjustments were needed, they were made. This was a professional unit responding to unexpected friction. Still, the uncertainty grew. Delays repeated. Progress required more input for less gain. Reports upward became more cautious in tone, though still controlled. Words like temporary and, manageable, appeared more frequently. No one suggested withdrawal. No one ordered acceleration. The platoon remained capable. Its weapons were ready, its crews alert. This was not failure. It was constraint, a condition not yet understood, but increasingly present. Armor that could advance was choosing not to force the issue without clarity. From a distance, nothing looked wrong. No smoke, no fire, no visible damage. The formation held its shape. But the absence of movement began to matter. Armor was meant to dictate tempo. When it slowed without enemy action, the reason demanded attention. Command weighed options without urgency. There was time. Contact had not been made. The situation did not require immediate correction. But the pause lingered longer than doctrine anticipated. What unsettled the moment was not danger, but uncertainty. The platoon had not been stopped by force. It had been slowed by something undefined. And until that factor was identified, movement forward carried a risk no one could yet measure. The platoon waited, engines idling, pressure building not from threat, but from the realization that something ordinary had begun to interfere with a force built to overcome it. Allied observers noticed the change before it carried meaning. Movement patterns did not align with expectation. The armor ahead advanced, then paused, not tactically, not in response to fire. The stops were uneven, unplanned, and repeated. For a force built on momentum, the hesitation stood out. Reconnaissance reports remained factual. Tanks were present, formation intact. No infantry deployment, no supporting fire. Engines idled longer than doctrine suggested. Spacing widened, then tightened again. The behavior did not indicate preparation for attack. It suggested adjustment. The information moved up the chain without emphasis. No alarms attached. No requests for immediate action. This was not contact. It was observation. The kind that required patience more than reaction. Allied commanders studied the reports carefully. Armor that slowed on its own was a problem best understood before exploited. Engagement would clarify intent, but it would also remove uncertainty in the wrong direction. Once fire was exchanged, the ground truth would be altered. Whatever was affecting movement would be masked by smoke, craters, and noise. The decision was made to hold fire. Recon units were instructed to continue monitoring. No probing shots, no harassment, no attempt to force response. The objective was clarity, not disruption. Observers refined their focus. Attention shifted from weapons to tracks, from turrets to spacing, from forward movement to what happened when vehicles tried to correct it. The ground was watched as closely as the armor. Soil displacement, water movement, the way weight settled after each stop. This restraint was not passive. It required discipline. Soldiers trained to engage when targets appeared now, held position, and recorded detail. The absence of action carried its own tension. Every minute of delay risked losing opportunity. Armor could break free. Conditions could change. Command understood this and accepted it. Patience was framed as a calculated risk. If the armor advanced, engagement plans were ready. If it withdrew, intelligence value would be preserved. But if it remained constrained, the situation might resolve itself without a shot fired. This approach ran against instinct. Underdog units often relied on speed and surprise. Here, advantage came from waiting, from allowing the enemy's own assumptions to operate unchecked, from trusting observation over impulse. Reports began to reflect this intent. Language tightened. Descriptions became more precise. Instead of halted, reports used restricted, Instead of delay, they noted repeated loss of traction. The pattern was forming, though still incomplete. Command did not label the behavior yet. No conclusions were drawn. But the absence of engagement became purposeful. A choice rather than a default. The battlefield was being read, not forced. Time passed without escalation. The armor remained where it was, neither advancing nor withdrawing. The situation settled into a quiet standoff, defined not by threat, but by uncertainty. Every minute confirmed that something beyond tactics was influencing events. In this stillness, control shifted subtly. The side that waited gained information. The side that moved gained resistance. Discipline, not firepower, defined the moment. The anticipation grew, not because action was imminent, but because restraint itself had become the strategy. And with each passing observation, the ground beneath the armor seemed to offer answers that weapons could not. The ground did not fail all at once. It resisted in stages, responding to weight rather than movement. When the first tank advanced, the surface held. Tracks pressed down, compressing soil that still retained structure. Forward motion continued, slow but controlled. Nothing yet suggested danger. Traction depends on consistency. Track links are designed to grip by spreading weight across surface area, biting just enough to move without sinking. That balance assumes resistance beneath. When soil absorbs water unevenly, that resistance changes. The surface layer can appear firm while the subsurface loses cohesion. Under repeated load, the upper layer collapses into what lies below. As the platoon continued, each vehicle altered the ground for the next. Tracks churned shallow ruts that filled with water instead of draining. The weight of steel forced moisture upward, lubricating soil already near saturation. Grip diminished gradually, not catastrophically. Forward progress became a negotiation with the ground. Crews compensated as trained. Engines increased output. Steering adjustments were made earlier. Spacing changed to avoid overlapping ruts. These responses were correct in isolation. Together, they compounded stress. More power increased slip. More correction increased churn. Each adjustment weakened the surface further. Immobilization did not arrive as a sudden stop. It arrived as resistance that no longer responded to input. Tracks rotated without advancing proportionally. Forward movement measured in meters required effort, usually reserved for kilometers. The tanks were not broken. They were trapped in a cycle of diminishing return. Mechanical strain replaced enemy contact as the primary concern. Engines ran hotter. Transmissions absorbed uneven loads. Suspension systems compressed beyond optimal range. None of this indicated failure, but all of it reduced margin. Armor, built to withstand fire, now faced a threat it could not suppress. Attempts to reposition worsened conditions. When a tank halted and tried to restart, the initial movement collapsed the softened soil beneath it. The vehicle settled deeper, increasing resistance further. The more it struggled, the more the ground adapted against it. This was not a battlefield engagement. No rounds were exchanged. No tactical maneuvers countered the problem. Firepower offered no solution. The enemy was not applying force. Gravity and saturation were. Allied observers documented the progression without interference. They noted how long it took for vehicles to regain momentum. They tracked changes in spacing and alignment. They watched how tracks displaced soil rather than gripping it. The pattern was consistent. Each movement attempt degraded conditions for the next. The realization emerged slowly. Armor superiority depended on the assumption that ground resistance remained within predictable limits. Here, it did not. The terrain was not impassable. It was selectively hostile. It allowed entry, then denied continuation. As minutes passed, the situation stabilized into constraint. Tanks could idle. They could adjust slightly. But forward momentum required effort that risked mechanical compromise. Withdrawal posed similar challenges. Reversing through degraded ground carried its own hazards. Command faced an unfamiliar calculation. Enemy fire had not dictated risk. Terrain had. The question was no longer tactical positioning, but mechanical survival. How long could engines run under strain? How much movement could be attempted without causing damage that would leave vehicles stranded? The armor's advantage had been neutralized without confrontation. Steel remained intact. Crews remained disciplined. But the machine's relationship with the ground had changed. It was no longer dominant. It was dependent. This was the moment when tension shifted from expectation to understanding. The threat was no longer hypothetical. It was measurable, quantified in traction loss, heat buildup, and soil displacement. The battlefield had imposed limits without firing a shot. The mud did not destroy the tanks. It rendered their purpose conditional. Movement, the core of armored doctrine, became optional rather than assured. In that space between capability and action, the outcome began to take shape. What had started as a routine advance was now a mechanical problem unfolding in real time. And with each passing minute, the ground continued to assert control over what steel could and could not do. The shift happened quickly once it began. Not dramatically, not visibly, but decisively. Time compressed as movement attempts increased. Engines that had idled now pushed harder. Crews tested limits, believing momentum could still be restored. Tracks turned with purpose, then with effort. Each rotation displaced more soil than distance gained. The ground responded by giving way in narrow increments, absorbing force instead of translating it. Within minutes, forward progress stopped being measurable. Tanks advanced, then settled. Adjustments became frequent. Small corrections stacked into larger problems. Vehicles that had maintained spacing now edged closer, constrained by ruts that dictated direction. The formation lost flexibility without losing discipline. The 14 minutes unfolded without sound of battle. No artillery, no small arms. Only engines straining against resistance that offered no target. Attempts to break free worsened the condition beneath the tracks. Soil that had supported partial movement collapsed under repeated stress. Mobility failed in sequence. One vehicle slowed to near standstill. Another followed. Not simultaneously, but predictably. As each tank struggled, the ground ahead became less viable for the next. The platoon was not ambushed. It was enclosed by its own passage. Command communications tightened. Reports shifted tone. Words like restricted gave way to unable to advance. Still no panic. Crews followed procedure. Engines were throttled back to prevent overheating. Movement attempts paused to assess options. Allied observers marked the moment carefully. They noted the change from delay to immobilization. This was not hesitation. It was loss of capability. The decision point arrived quietly. Engagement was no longer necessary. Fire would add risk without benefit. Command chose restraint. Orders confirmed continued observation. No harassment. No pressure. The objective was containment, not destruction. The armor was already neutralized by conditions it could not change. The battlefield held still. Tanks idled in place, surrounded by ground that no longer allowed them to maneuver. Withdrawal posed equal risk. Reverse movement required traction that no longer existed. Recovery vehicles could not reach them without facing the same problem. The defeat was complete without being obvious. Steel remained unscarred. Crews remained alive. Weapons remained unused. Yet the mission had failed. Armor that could not move could not threaten. The decisive factor had asserted itself without confrontation. Minutes earlier, the situation had been uncertain. Now it was settled. The 14-minute window, closed as options, narrowed to maintenance and survival rather than advance. The platoon had not been forced back. It had been stopped in place by an environment that offered no negotiation. Allied commanders confirmed the assessment. The armor was fixed. No further action was required. The decision carried weight. Choosing not to engage meant accepting an unconventional victory. It meant trusting observation over impulse. It meant allowing an enemy force to be defeated without visible struggle. There was no signal to mark the moment, no report of surrender, no explosion to signify outcome. The only evidence was absence. Absence of movement, absence of escalation, absence of need. The underdog advantage lay not in firepower, but in patience. In recognizing when conditions had already decided the fight. In allowing time and terrain to finish what planning had begun. The 14 minutes did not feel like victory as they passed. They felt like confirmation. A quiet closing of possibility. When the window ended, it did not slam shut. It simply no longer existed. Armor doctrine relied on shock and momentum. Here, neither applied. The tanks remained present, but irrelevant, their power suspended by circumstances beyond doctrine's reach. No shots were fired to claim success. No positions were overrun. The ground had done the work without instruction. The Allied response had been to recognize it, then step aside. In the aftermath, the battlefield returned to stillness. Engines idled. Observers continued to watch. Nothing changed outwardly, but the outcome was no longer in doubt. The invisible defeat had been delivered, complete, irreversible. Achieved not through force, but through understanding when force was unnecessary. The reports were read again, slowly this time. Not for confirmation, but for understanding. Timelines were aligned, observations compared. What had first appeared as delay was now clearly defined as loss of mobility. The language shifted from description to assessment. The outcome was no longer questioned. It was examined. Command did not rush to capitalize. There was no order to press forward, no call to exploit exposed armor. The absence of movement was not treated as weakness to be struck, but as a condition to be managed. Leadership recognized that the situation had resolved itself in an unusual way, and that interfering with it carried unnecessary risk. Containment became the priority. Units were instructed to hold positions, maintain observation, and avoid actions that might alter the ground conditions. Fire plans were reviewed and quietly shelved. The tanks were fixed in place, but they were still armed. Provocation could change the equation quickly. This was not hesitation. It was control. Command understood that forcing an outcome could introduce variables already removed by restraint. The environment had delivered a result without loss. Preserving that result required discipline equal to any attack. Field officers weighed the implications carefully. Recovery attempts by the immobilized platoon were possible. External support might arrive. Weather could shift. Nothing about the situation was permanent. Orders reflected this reality. Observation posts were reinforced. Reporting intervals shortened. The emphasis remained on stability rather than pressure. Relief was present, but muted. The absence of casualties mattered. The avoidance of combat mattered. But relief did not lead to satisfaction. Leadership understood that what had occurred was not a victory to be claimed loudly. It was a responsibility to be handled correctly. Ethical restraint entered the discussion without being named. The decision not to engage was not framed as mercy or superiority. It was framed as necessity. The enemy had been neutralized by circumstance. Adding violence would not improve the outcome. It would only complicate it. This approach required confidence, not in firepower, but in judgment. Leaders accepted that the most effective action had already been taken by not acting. That restraint, once chosen, had to be protected against impulse and expectation. Orders were clarified down the chain. No harassment fire. No probing movements. No attempts to draw reaction. Soldiers were instructed to remain alert, not aggressive. The tone was professional, deliberate, and calm. This was not a moment for improvisation. Command also acknowledged uncertainty. There was no doctrine for this outcome. No checklist for victory achieved without engagement. Reports were annotated carefully, noting factors rather than conclusions. Soil saturation, vehicle spacing, repeated stress. These details would matter later, but for now they informed restraint. The immobilized armor remained under watch. Engines were shut down intermittently to manage heat. Crews stayed with their vehicles. There were no signs of panic. The situation on both sides settled into an uneasy stillness, defined by mutual awareness. Leadership monitored the balance closely. Too much pressure could provoke action. Too little attention could invite recovery. The objective was to hold the line exactly where it was, allowing time and conditions to maintain the advantage already achieved. Responsibility weighed heavier than triumph. Command understood that success without combat still carried consequences. A misstep could reverse the outcome. A single shot could escalate the situation beyond control. Maintaining discipline now mattered as much as any maneuver earlier. As the hours passed, the reality of what had occurred became clearer. An armored threat had been removed without engagement. Not through deception or fire, but through patience and understanding of conditions. Leadership recognized the rarity of the moment. They did not seek credit. They sought stability. Orders reflected that priority. The front remained quiet. Observation continued. The situation held. In that quiet, command accepted the outcome fully. Relief gave way to sober responsibility. The job was no longer to win, but to ensure that what had already been achieved was not undone by unnecessary action. Victory, in this case, required restraint to endure. $1,000. And leadership understood that preserving it would demand the same discipline that had made it possible. The absence of gunfire changed the meaning of what had occurred. For the immobilized crews, the defeat carried no single moment of impact. There was no strike to measure, no enemy to face directly. The loss arrived as realization rather than shock. Engines idled where progress had been expected. Orders shifted from advance to maintenance. The mission ended without having truly begun. Morale responded unevenly. Confusion came first, then frustration. The crews had not been outmatched by skill or force. They had not been overrun. Their machines were intact. Their training sound. Yet they were contained by conditions that offered no clear response. There was nothing to fight. No corrective action that restored purpose. The result was disquieting. For soldiers trained to measure outcome through engagement, this kind of defeat unsettled expectations. Discipline held, but confidence bent inward. The ground had imposed limits without explanation or warning. The implication was difficult to ignore. If power could be neutralized without opposition, then control was less certain than doctrine suggested. On the Allied side, the response was no less complex. There was relief in the absence of casualties. That relief carried weight rather than celebration. Soldiers accustomed to defining success through fire and movement now faced an outcome that denied those markers. No advance had been made, no ground taken. Yet the threat had been removed. Processing that success required adjustment. The restraint that had preserved the situation also delayed recognition of its significance. Men continued to watch, to record, to wait for escalation that never came. It took time to accept that waiting had been the decisive action. Some felt discomfort at the imbalance. Victory without confrontation lacked the clarity of resolution. There were no visible consequences to justify the outcome. No surrender, no withdrawal, just stillness. The enemy remained present, aware, and constrained. That awareness cut both ways. The absence of violence forced reflection. Combat had not defined the moment. Judgment had. Terrain had. Patience had replaced aggression as the operative force. This challenged ingrained assumptions about effectiveness and purpose. It raised questions that could not be answered by training alone. The weight of the outcome became clearer as time passed. The lack of fire had preserved lives on both sides. It had also denied release. There was no emotional discharge to close the event, no moment to mark completion. The situation lingered, unresolved in feeling even as it was settled tactically. This kind of success demanded maturity. It required accepting that restraint could carry as much consequence as action, that not all victories announce themselves, that some outcomes impose responsibility rather than pride. The soldiers understood this gradually, through continued observation, through the quiet acknowledgement that nothing more needed to be done. The moral paradox lay not in what had been avoided, but in what had been achieved without force. In the end, the absence of violence did not lessen the significance. It increased it. The result carried weight precisely because it could not be celebrated easily. It remained with those who witnessed it, shaping how they understood control, power, and the limits of both. The battlefield stayed silent. The meaning did not. The reports that followed were written carefully. Not as celebration, not as anomaly, but as record. Timelines were reconstructed. Soil conditions noted. Weather logs cross-referenced with movement data. What had occurred was translated into language doctrine could understand, even if it had not predicted it. After action summaries avoided dramatic conclusions. They did not claim innovation. They described interaction, armor, terrain, time. The sequence was clear. Movement degraded as saturation increased. Traction failed incrementally. Decision-making that favored restraint preserved the outcome. These were not tactics taught as decisive. They were conditions acknowledged too late to be corrected, but early enough to be respected. The lesson did not elevate cleverness over strength. It rebalanced them. Firepower remained essential. Armor remained dominant when conditions allowed. But the event forced recognition that dominance depended on context more than design. Machines did not operate in isolation. They functioned within environments that could amplify or erase advantage. Environmental awareness gained weight in discussion, not as a substitute for force, but as a factor equal to it. Ground was no longer treated as passive backdrop. It was analyzed as dynamic, capable of shaping outcome without engagement, capable of deciding movement before contact occurred. What stood out was how routine the decisive elements had been. Rain logged as insignificant. Soil classified as workable. A holding front labeled stable. None of these factors were unusual on their own. Together, they produced an outcome that no weapon system could reverse. This reframing carried philosophical weight. War often rewards decisive action, but here it rewarded attention. Noticing what others dismissed. Allowing conditions to speak before forcing response. The absence of intervention became the intervention. There was admiration, but it was quiet, not directed at individuals, but at discipline, at leadership that resisted impulse, at soldiers who accepted waiting as action, at a system that allowed judgment to override expectation. No new doctrine was written overnight. No manuals were rewritten in response. But the margins changed. Notes were added. Caveats included. Terrain analysis gained prominence. Weather was no longer summarized and set aside so quickly. Minor variables were treated with more caution. The event resisted simplification. It did not suggest that mud defeated armor universally, or that patience always outperformed aggression. It demonstrated something narrower and more useful. That outcomes often hinge on small factors, compounded over time. That control sometimes comes from recognizing when force is unnecessary. For veterans, the lesson resonated beyond theory. Many had seen moments where restraint mattered more than action, where survival depended on judgment rather than strength. This event fit within that understanding. It validated experience without exaggeration. The legacy of the mud trick was not a tactic to be copied blindly. It was a reminder that the battlefield is shaped by what is noticed and what is ignored. That routine details can become decisive under pressure. That humility toward environment is as important as confidence in equipment. In the end, the ground did not defeat the armor. It revealed the limits of assumption, and in doing so, it left a lesson that outlasted the moment itself. They were trained to fire when conditions allowed it, to seize advantage when it appeared, to act decisively once the moment arrived. In this case, the moment came and passed without a trigger pulled. For many of the soldiers watching the immobilized armor, restraint did not feel like success. It felt unfinished. Weapons remained ready, positions held. Yet the action they had prepared for never arrived. The discipline to wait ran against instinct, sharpened by training and experience. There was internal conflict in that waiting. The sense that something more should be done. That effort without visible action carried less weight. These men were not denied courage. They were denied its usual expression. Holding fire required a different kind of resolve, one that offered no release. Traditional heroism left little room for this outcome. No advance to recount. No engagement to mark the day. The absence of violence removed the familiar markers by which service was often measured. What remained was duty performed quietly, without recognition. Some felt unease in the aftermath. The lack of casualties brought relief, but also a strange dislocation. Survivors' guilt existed even without loss, shaped by the knowledge that events could have turned differently. That restraint had spared lives, but also denied the clarity that combat sometimes brings. There was no bitterness in this realization. Only humility, an understanding that effectiveness does not always align with expectation, that doing less can sometimes carry more consequence than doing more. These soldiers did not claim credit. They returned to routine with little outward change. Watches rotated. Reports filed. The moment passed into record without ceremony. Their contribution was measured not in action taken, but in action withheld. In the patience to trust judgment over impulse, in the acceptance that service does not always announce itself. They did not fire, and that was the point. In official records, the event occupies little space. A brief notation, a reference to immobilized armor, no casualty figures to highlight it, no captured ground to define it. The language is careful and minimal, reflecting an outcome that resisted classification. There are reasons for that absence. History often favors moments that burn. Engagements marked by fire, loss, and movement leave clear evidence. They fit established frameworks for victory and defeat. What occurred here did not. It produced no dramatic shift in lines, no visible wreckage, no decisive exchange to anchor memory. The result was administrative rather than spectacular, logged under conditions and constraints, filed alongside weather effects and terrain notes, useful for study, but not for commemoration. Without action to frame it, the moment slipped quietly into the margins. This is how certain victories fade, not because they lack importance, but because they challenge how success is defined. War records tend to preserve what is loud and costly. They struggle to hold what is subtle and restrained. Yet within those narrow entries, the outcome remains intact. An armored threat neutralized, lives spared, control maintained without escalation. The absence of recognition does not reduce the weight of the result. It only changes who notices it. For those who value overlooked moments, the significance is clear. Some victories endure not through remembrance, but through influence, quietly shaping judgment, quietly reinforcing restraint. This one remains where it was left. In the record, understated, in its meaning, complete. The battle ended without sound, because it was never fought in the usual sense. The ground decided what steel could not. Weight met resistance. Assumption met limit. In that exchange, environment proved decisive, not as an enemy, but as a condition that demanded respect. What endured was not a tactic, but humility. The understanding that power depends on context. That control begins with attention. That judgment can outweigh force when patience is allowed to work. The victory was intellectual, not visible. It left no scars on metal, but it altered how strength was measured. Long after movement resumed elsewhere, the lesson remained. Some battles are won by recognizing when the ground has already spoken.